Hi and welcome to section 4.3 for Econ 1 on the AQA exam board. Today we're going to be looking at monopoly behaviour and the positives and negatives of a monopoly. A monopoly is where we have a sole producer of a good or service. A monopoly is able to restrict output. So here we have a supply and demand diagram. If the market was operating in perfect competition, the equilibrium would be at the point where supply intercepts demand. This would lead to a level of output of Q1 and a price level of P1. But a monopoly is able to restrict output. Let's suppose that our monopoly reduced output from Q1 to Q monopoly. The market rations out this reduced quantity by the price rising. So at a quantity of Q monopoly, we go from that quantity up to the demand curve and we see that the price with this level of output, Q monopoly, will be P monopoly, which is much higher than P1. A monopoly is able to do this because there are no alternative firms to purchase this good or service from. Consumers have to buy the good and service from this monopoly. They cannot go to any other firms because the monopoly is the sole producer of this good or service. If a firm that was operating in perfect competition chose to raise their prices, then consumers would switch from consuming at that firm to consuming at another firm because the good or service will be cheaper. The consumer would be happy to switch because in perfect competition all of our goods are homogeneous. This means that it doesn't matter where the consumer purchases the good from because they will be the same. A monopoly can either control output or price. It can never control both. So in our example, our monopoly was controlling output. It decided to restrict its output from Q1 to Q monopoly. At a quantity of Q monopoly, it led to a price of P monopoly. Alternatively, the monopoly could have said that we're going to supply as many goods and services at a price of P monopoly. And at a price of P monopoly, this would have led to a quantity of Q monopoly being produced. A monopoly would want to restrict output or raise the price because it is more profitable to do so. And we are assuming that our monopoly is a profit maximising monopoly. So now let's look at what the welfare effects are of the monopoly restricting output. With this market, we are making the assumption that the monopoly has the same cost as all the firms that are operating in perfect competition. We will relax this assumption later on. So in perfect competition, the market would be at an equilibrium at point E, where supply intercepts demand. This leads to a price of P1 and a quantity of Q1. We can now find the level of consumer surplus when the market is operating in perfect competition. Consumer surplus is the difference between the total amount that consumers are willing and able to pay for a good and service minus what they actually pay for the good or service. What they are willing and able to pay for a good and service is indicated by the demand curve, and what they actually pay is indicated by the market price, which in this case is P1. On our diagram here, this area is represented by the green triangle, which is A, P1, E. We can now find what the level of producer surplus is in our economy. Producer surplus is an economic measure of the difference between the amount a producer of a good or service receives and the minimal amount the producer is willing to accept for the good, which is the supply curve. So it's the difference between the market price and what they are willing to supply the good to the market for. On our diagram, this works out to be the orange triangle, which is area B, P1, E. We can now work out what total welfare is for the economy when it is operating in perfect competition. Total welfare is worked out by adding the producer surplus to the consumer surplus and the government surplus. Here, the government is having no effect on the market, and therefore the government surplus will be zero. So we just add consumer surplus to producer surplus. This gives us an area of AEB, which is the green triangle plus the orange triangle. So now let's move on to what the welfare effects are when we have a monopoly operating in this market with the same cost as all the firms that would be operating in perfect competition. We know that our monopoly will want to restrict output or raise the price, as this is more profitable. So the firm restricts output from Q1 to Qmon, which leads to a price of Pmon in the market. At a price of Pmon, the level of consumer surplus in the economy is A Pmon C, which is the yellow triangle on the diagram. The area of producer surplus in the economy is the area B Pmon C D. We can now work out what total welfare is when we have a monopoly in this market. Total welfare will be the area A, B, D, C. We can now compare the welfare when we are operating in perfect competition and the welfare when we have a monopoly. With perfect competition, consumer surplus was the area A, P1E. With a monopoly, consumer surplus falls to area A, Pmon C, which is a difference of Pmon C E P1. So consumers are worse off when we have a monopoly rather than perfect competition. Let's now compare the effects for firms. When the market was in perfect competition, the level of producer surplus was B P1E. When we have a monopoly, the area for producer surplus was B Pmon C D. When we compare these two areas, we see that producer surplus falls by the area D F E, but rises by the area Pmon P1 F C. And this area is greater than the fall in producer surplus. Therefore, producer surplus rises when they are operating under monopoly conditions. This means that producers would prefer to be operating under monopoly conditions. Let's now look at the effects for total welfare. Total welfare in the economy falls when they are operating in monopoly conditions. It falls by the area C, D, E. And this area is known as the dead weight welfare loss. So if we assume that a monopoly will have the same cost as all the firms that will be operating under perfect competition, we will see that consumer surplus falls, producer surplus rises, and overall welfare in the economy falls. So a reduction in overall welfare is a negative for a monopoly. There are also some other negatives for a monopoly. Another negative of a monopoly is reduction in choice. This is because you only have one firm to purchase the good or service from. When there are many firms operating in a market, it is likely that the goods will be slightly differentiated from each other, and you could choose the good that is most suited to you. Another negative could be that the monopoly could become productively inefficient. This is because there are no incentives to reduce costs in the factory and come up with more efficient ways of using resources because there are no competitors for the monopoly. Another negative is that there may be a lack of innovation. This again stems from the fact that there are no competitors in the economy, resulting in there being no incentives to keep pushing the boundaries in the hope of creating a better and better product. This could mean that technological advancement is slow. However, there are some advantages to monopolies. One is economies of scale. As a firm exploits its monopoly power, it can grow and reap the rewards of economies of scale. This would result in lower costs that can be passed on to consumers. But this may not be the case because the monopoly may choose to maximise profit instead. So the outcome depends on how the monopoly chooses to react. Another positive of a monopoly is that it may actually increase choice. An example is the BBC and ITV. There is usually more choice between BBC channels compared to the choice between BBC One and ITV One. For example, on a Saturday evening, BBC One and ITV have similar shows such as X Factor and Strictly Come Dancing, and then they usually choose to play a film later. A monopoly may also have a greater level of dynamic efficiency. This is because a monopoly will have barriers to entry, and this protects their inventions and innovations from other firms, resulting in the firm experiencing the full benefit from conducting research and development. This would encourage a firm to increase their spending on R&D, which can result in better quality products. A monopoly could also become a world leader in its field and then could export its goods and services abroad. This would be a positive for an economy. Another advantage of a monopoly is the avoidance of duplications of infrastructure. This is especially the case for a national monopoly where competition would be wasteful. For example, if all electricity wires had to be owned by the company whose electricity is travelling through them, then we would have multiple wires doing the same job, which is a waste of resources. A final positive for a monopoly is that they can segment the market. A monopoly may segment the market in such a way that more people are able to use or consume the good or service. For example, a bus firm may use its revenue from peak times to subsidise times when the service is less busy. This would result in there always being a good service for the local community. They could also use the revenues gained from adults to reduce the fares for children. The effects of a monopoly all depend on how the monopoly chooses to act and conduct itself.